I'm the middle sibling of 3 brothers. Growing up, the 2 of them were always involved in the Boy Scouts. My older brother Ryan took it really seriously. He ended up becoming an Eagle Scout, which, from what I remember, was a huge deal in our family. My younger brother tried Scouts for a little while too, but he quit somewhere during the Boy Scout years. For some reason though, I was never part of it. My parents never really pushed me into joining, and I never understood why. Looking back now, maybe they thought 2 kids in Scouts was already enough. But as a kid, I remember feeling strangely left out, especially whenever my mom would bring me along to watch Ryan participate in troop events. One of the biggest ones I remember was the Pinewood Derby races. I'd sit there in the audience watching all the Scouts, cheering for their handmade cars racing down those wooden tracks. Ryan always looked so proud, standing with the other Scouts in their uniforms. I remember thinking it looked like they belonged to some kind of club that I wasn't allowed into. But the thing I was most jealous of were the campouts. Every couple of months, Ryan Troop would go out into the woods for the weekend. They'd pack up tents, sleeping bags, lanterns, and all kinds of camping gear. I went along for the drive once or twice when my parents dropped him off. I remember seeing the Scouts setting up tents in a clearing, building campfires, laughing together like they were on some big adventure. But because I wasn't part of the troop, I never got to stay. My parents would just drive me back home. And as a kid, that always bothered me more than I admitted. So one summer, when I was about 8 years old, Ryan brought his Scout tent home a few days before one of their trips. The troop leaders wanted everyone to practice setting up their tents in their backyards. I remember watching him assemble the tent on the grass behind our house. It wasn't anything fancy, just one of those small green dome tents Scouts use. But to me, it looked like the gateway to all the adventures I had been missing. That was when I got the idea. I asked Ryan if we could pretend we were on a real camping trip and sleep in the tent overnight in the backyard. At first, he laughed at the idea, but after a little convincing, he agreed. And surprisingly, our parents went along with it too. Looking back now, that night was supposed to be nothing more than a harmless little childhood adventure, but it ended up becoming one of the most terrifying nights of my life. Our house at the time was just outside Asheville, North Carolina, in one of those quiet neighborhoods where the houses were spread out and the backyards kind of blended together. There weren't many fences separating the properties. Instead, there were clusters of trees and thick brush that acted as natural borders between yards. As a kid, that made the whole place feel a lot bigger than it actually was. Our backyard alone felt huge to me back then. It stretched out into a wide patch of grass before reaching a line of trees that separated our yard from the next property. Near the middle of the yard, my dad had built a small stone fire pit a few years earlier. That night, my parents decided to play along with our little camping idea. Just before sunset, my dad helped Ryan build a small fire in the pit so we could roast marshmallows like real campers. The smell of burning wood drifted through the yard while the sky slowly turned that deep orange color you only see right before the sun disappears. My little brother came outside with us too. He must have been about 4 years old at the time, and he thought the whole thing was the coolest thing in the world. He sat in one of the lawn chairs near the fire, while Ryan and I poked marshmallows with long metal sticks. Half the time they would catch on fire before we could even pull them away from the flames, which usually ended with Ryan laughing while I tried blowing out the burning marshmallow. Eventually though, it started getting late. My parents decided my little brother was way too young to sleep outside in a tent, so they brought him back inside the house while Ryan and I finished putting away the camping stuff. The fire in the pit was mostly burned down by then, leaving only glowing orange embers that cracked softly in the night air. Ryan zipped up the tent, and we crawled inside with our sleeping bags. Around that time, the Game Boy Advance SP had just come out, and like most kids our age, we were obsessed with them. So before actually trying to sleep, we both pulled our Game Boys out of our backpacks. Ryan started playing one of his racing games, while I loaded up Super Mario Bros. 2, a game I had been completely addicted to at the time, even though I had never actually beaten it. For a while, the tent was filled with nothing but the faint glow of our screens and the quiet sound of button clicks. Eventually though, Ryan turned his Game Boy off and said he was going to sleep. A few minutes later, I did the same. But even after closing my eyes and rolling onto my side inside the sleeping bag, I quickly realized something. I couldn't fall asleep. Not even a little. Maybe it was the fact that I had never slept in a sleeping bag before, or maybe it was just the excitement of being outside at night. Either way, I just lay there, staring into the darkness of the tent, listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood settling into silence. At some point though, without realizing it, I must have drifted off. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up. At first, I was just confused. For a few seconds, I didn't even remember where I was. Everything around me was dark, and the air inside the tent felt different from my bedroom. It took a moment for my brain to catch up and remember that Ryan and I were sleeping outside in the backyard. I slowly lifted my head inside the sleeping bag and looked around. The inside of the tent was almost completely black, except for a faint gray glow from the moonlight shining through the thin fabric above us. I could still hear the soft crackling sound coming from the fire pit outside, though by that point the fire had probably burned down to nothing but coals. I rolled onto my other side, and that's when I noticed something strange. Ryan's sleeping bag looked empty. At first I thought maybe he had just rolled over or moved in a weird position, but the shape of the bag was completely flat. I pushed myself up on one elbow and stared at it a little longer. He wasn't there. I remember whispering his name quietly. "Ryan?" No answer. I sat up a little more, expecting him to respond or maybe laugh and say he had gone inside the house, but the tent stayed completely silent. That was when I noticed something else. The zipper of the tent was still fully closed. If Ryan had gone inside the house, he would have had to unzip the tent to get out, and if he had zipped it back up after leaving, I would have heard it. At least I think I would have. A strange feeling started forming in my chest. It wasn't full panic yet, but it was enough to make me uneasy about being alone out there. I decided I didn't want to stay in the tent by myself anymore, so I slowly crawled toward the entrance and reached for the zipper. But before opening it all the way, I did something that seemed like a smart idea at the time. I pulled the zipper down just enough to peek outside first. I didn't want to climb out of the tent and suddenly realize I was alone in the dark backyard, so I leaned forward and carefully looked out through the small opening. At first, my brain didn't even process what I was looking at. The backyard was dark, but the moon was bright enough that I could still see the general shape of things. The fire pit sat about 20 feet away from the tents, and the last few embers were still glowing faintly in the center of it. And sitting in one of the lawn chairs next to the fire pit was a man. He was just sitting there, completely still, facing directly toward the tent. For a moment, I wondered if maybe it was my dad. Maybe he had come outside to check on us. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something about the shape of the person looked wrong. My dad wasn't that tall, and he definitely didn't sit that still. This man hadn't moved at all since I first saw him. Even worse, I realized something else. If I could see him clearly from the tent, then he could definitely see me. A sudden rush of fear shot through my body. I sucked in a quick breath and immediately pulled my head back inside the tent. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my ears. I quickly pulled the zipper shut again and crawled back into my sleeping bag, pulling it up almost over my face like that thin layer of fabric was somehow going to protect me. The inside of the tent was silent. For a few seconds, I just lay there, completely frozen, trying to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it really had been my dad. But then I heard something outside. The sound of the chair near the fire pit shifting slightly across the ground. My entire body went stiff. The man had moved. I stared toward the wall of the tent, barely breathing, hoping that if I stayed perfectly still, the person outside might think the tent was empty. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I saw it. A shadow slowly appeared on the thin fabric of the tent wall as something blocked the moonlight outside. The shadow grew larger and larger until it stopped right next to where I was lying. Whoever that man was. He was now standing directly outside the tent. I felt like my body had completely stopped working. I wanted to scream for my dad, but my throat felt locked shut. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop. The slow, quiet sound of the tent zipper beginning to move. It dragged downward just a few inches, very slowly. The opening was still small, but it was enough for a tiny gap to form near the bottom of the tent. And through that small gap, I saw an eye. One single eye pressed against the opening, staring directly at me in the darkness. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. That eye was so close to the opening that I could see the white of it reflecting the faint moonlight outside. It wasn't blinking, it was just staring directly at me. The man knew I was there. I remember feeling completely paralyzed, like my body had forgotten how to react. My brain was screaming at me to do something, run, yell, anything, but nothing happened. Then the eye squinted slightly. It wasn't a normal blink. It looked more like the way someone's eyes narrow when they're smiling, except I couldn't see the rest of his face. The zipper moved again, just another inch. The opening grew slightly wider, and I suddenly realized that if he pulled it down a little more, he could reach his hand inside the tent. That was the moment my body finally reacted. I screamed. Not a small shout either. It was one of those loud, panicked screams that just explodes out of you before you even realize you're making the sound. At the same time, I kicked my legs free from the sleeping bag and scrambled backward as fast as I could. In the chaos, my foot slammed into one of the tent poles. The entire tent shook violently, and one side partially collapsed inward. Outside, I immediately heard footsteps. Fast ones. The man took off running across the yard. Almost instantly after that, the back porch light of our house flipped on, lighting up the entire yard through the thin fabric of the tents. I could hear my dad yelling as the back door burst open. "What's going on?" His footsteps pounded across the grass as he ran toward the fire pit. By the time he reached the tent, though, whoever that man was had already disappeared into the darkness beyond the yard. Everything after that happened pretty quickly. My dad pulled the tent open and found me half tangled in my sleeping bag, shaking and crying. I remember trying to explain what I had just seen, but the words kept getting stuck in my throat. My mom came running outside a few seconds later, still in her pajamas, asking what was going on. By the time my dad finished searching around the yard and checking the tree line, whoever that man was had completely vanished. My parents called the police not long after. I don't remember a lot about that part of the night. I was so shaken up that my mom eventually brought me inside and had me sleep in my parents' bed. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours, replaying that moment in my head over and over again. That eye looking through the gap in the tent. For the next few weeks, my parents didn't let me out of their sight much. Walking to school, playing outside, even riding my bike around the neighborhood, suddenly came with a lot more supervision. Eventually, though, things started to calm down, or at least it felt that way. Then, one afternoon during recess at my school, something happened that made my stomach drop in a way I can still remember perfectly. I went to a small Catholic school, and our playground was basically just a large concrete yard surrounded by a tall metal fence. On the far side of the fence was the street. During recess, a few of us were playing one of those running games kids make up. At one point I had to run across the yard to the fence to be safe. I grabbed onto the metal bars and turned around to watch the others. That was when I heard someone say, "Hey." The voice came from the other side of the fence. I turned toward it and saw a man standing there on the sidewalk. At first, he just looked like someone asking for directions. But then he said something that instantly made my heart sink. "Your name's Chris, right?" I froze. I hadn't told him my name, and before I could even think of a response, the man smiled slightly and said something I'll never forget. "You don't remember me, do you?" For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind instantly jumped back to that night in the backyard. The man sitting by the fire pit, the zipper slowly opening, the single eye staring into the tent. The voice was the same, or at least it sounded the same to me. My heart started racing so fast I could feel it pounding in my chest. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get away from that fence. So I lied. I shook my head quickly and said, "No, that's not my name." The man kept smiling, almost like he found that amusing. Then he leaned slightly closer to the fence and said, very calmly, That's strange." For a second, it looked like he was about to say something else, but instead he just stared at me for another moment. That was when I turned and ran. I sprinted across the playground straight toward one of the recess monitors and pointed back at the fence. By the time the teachers looked over, the man was already gone. Completely gone. The school called my parents immediately, and they picked me up early that day. I remember my mom looking more scared than I had ever seen her before when I told her what happened. After that, my parents were extremely protective for a long time. I was never allowed to walk anywhere alone. Someone always came with me to school. Even playing outside in the neighborhood wasn't the same anymore. Eventually, as the years went by, life returned to normal, but that experience never really left me. Even now as an adult, I still think about that night sometimes. About how close that man got to opening the tent. About how he somehow knew my name weeks later. And about the possibility that if I hadn't screamed when I did, my life might have turned out very differently.